Welcome to the Lucid Horizon. This is the 11th episode of a series of talk that we've had in this series on various matters about education, democracy, economic growth and development. In the last 5 episodes, we've spent some quality time with Professor Hasan Mansour, a world expert on Iran economy, and we have been enlightened by various conversations that we've had with Professor Mansour, and we are going to continue and our conversation on the economic growth and development and the relationship between the two, and we're going to pick up the question from where we left off last time. Professor Mansour, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Professor Kangaloo. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
You're fresh about the subjects that we covered, at least in the last episode, about the models of socioeconomic development of Iran, and some basic definitions and the necessities for development and growth and the prerequisites for them. So this time, we want to talk about the obstacles and hurdles on the way for economic growth and economic development, and if they are really, they can be very briefly discussed and taught to our audience.
Yes, indeed. Well, to begin with, economic growth. For economic growth, we need resources, of course. So there's a difference between resource-rich and resource-poor countries. So without diversifying our attention, we look at the situation in Iran because our main concentration is a development in Iran, which is a resource-rich country. So what kind of hurdles, impediments, difficulties do we have for growth and development in Iran? We have discussed the question of growth and the limits to growth before. I've tried to explain the limits to growth from the point of view of the internal resources and external markets. So one of the theories which have been very controversial within the field of economics was the question of limits of the market for growth. We've decided it, we've discussed it, and I have concluded that, well, even if that is a big problem to enter into the market, and there are some inherent limits into the market growth. So a new country entering into the realm of international markets will face, inevitably will face difficulties. It's got to be competitive. And even so, there are difficulties to it that sometimes even it creates resistance to the expanding of that country into the world market. Apart from the prices and competitiveness, the question is that of the absorption of that new entity into the world market. Are they ready to do that? Well, the theory of limits to the market explains that, well, at certain cases, it can provide a serious hurdle for the country to enter. That we have kind of expanded the theory, so I'm not going to repeat that story. But there are internally and externally some limiting factors to growth. Internally, the question is the social structure. So we need some reform in social structure in order to provide for the labor force that we need in the new industries. If that population is not present in the cities, which normally is not in an underdeveloped country, then we need land reforms in order to release the labor force from the countryside to the economies. This engenders the process of immigration, which we have touched upon several times, and for which we need to have a planning. So this is one of the internal hurdles of development. So in the case of Iran, we had a successful land reform. But even land reform, it had its deficiencies. So you make a land reform, and without providing the necessary institutions for success of land reform, those people who have got the land they may leave the land, as great many people did, and end up in the cities. So this forced urbanization was a continuation of land reform, and which ended up, as we mentioned in previous session, with a slum dwelling of about 3 to 4 million people in the suburbs of Tehran. This creates its own problems, like the crimes in the suburbs and the unregulated job and underground economy, and all this may create both economic, social, and security problems for the country. So this is an area which has got to be watched for. So we have irregulated and the planned immigration from the countryside to the cities where we can absorb the workforce which are arriving.
So, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
No.
Get a question.
No. I just wanted to make sure that you have completely exhausted all the list of hurdles and obstacles before I pose my next question. So go ahead and finish your argument.
Now, I'll just touch on the titles of these inhibitions. One is that the question of providing the workforce for industries, which entails immigration and immigration from countryside. And then the question is the question of social coherence. By the very start of this, social mobility increases, and social mobility it means that countryside people end up in the urban areas where the norms are different. And in a period of 2, 3, 4 years, we find anomalies, and great deal of anomalies, social anomalies. That is, you have a population which are not in harmony with the city life, nor with the countryside life. So here it may grow even in the city. This is what Iran went through. The question of loss of identity. Sociologists talked a great deal about loss of identity in Iran in years, 2, 3 years before the revolution. Loss of identity, not only for the people who had immigrated into the suburban areas of Tehran, but even for the people for the population of Tehran. So gradually there was a feeling that we are not the same people. We have experienced it, that even the combination of the people, the people who attended ceremonies like in restaurants or in cabarets, they became different. So because the newly arrived people, they had gained access to better income, those who got employment. They also started using the same services as the urban population did. So in even top cabarets of Tehran, you realize that the combination of the people, the perplex complexion of the people has changed. Once there was only well-to-do and the elite of the country which attended those areas. But in 2 years before revolution, you had the people from the south of Tehran attending the same cabarets. And then in a very short period, you realize that even the type of artists performing in those areas changed. So the artists of this southern Tehran, they moved into those cabarets, and this made those people who were living in those areas kind of, it provided them a feeling of alienation in their own areas. And of course, this affects the relationship, the approach, the behavior of people vis-a-vis each other. And this feeling of alienation was a serious problem. This can grow in many countries. Again, if we don't have a management for the system, it can grow out of hand, which in the Iranian case did grow out of hand. So expansion of, in certain areas, expansion of prostitution, it became one of the areas. Why? Because you have a population of 3-4 million young people, mostly men, coming to suburban areas where there are no institutions to absorb them. And many of them were bachelors. And then The only areas they could attend were the prostitution, and that became a problem. At increase of prostitution, it played into the hands of the religious bigots who could use it as an alibi to organize a revolt. So this is another area, the change of attitudes, behaviors, and the creation of loss of identity for the population living in those industrialized and growing cities.
So all these barriers and obstacles that you enumerated against that could be erected against development, are they unique to secular governments, or it seems to me like they should also exist and should actually be amplified and worsened and in a dictatorship like the Islamic Republic? But for some reason, the government of the Islamic Republic seems to have been able to manage the revolt of the young people and the social mobility and the lack of responsiveness by the government into the social dislocation of a vast swath of people from the countrysides to the cities and to the urban areas. You know, it seems to me like this government, the government of the Islamic Republic, should have these problems even worse than the government of the Shah. So how come that those factors, those obstacles that resulted into social dissatisfaction and discontent resulted in overthrow of the government of the Shah, but this government seems to be stable and completely in the position of power and don't seem to be moved by all these obstacles against development and the consequences of the social unrest?
Well, I think we have touched upon the answer to this question before, because the Islamic Republic is not compatible with development at all. They don't want development. What they want is growth, in case they can succeed, in which they haven't succeeded much, because the Iranian GDP has grown to about 70% compared to the advent of revolution, beginning of revolution, while the population has grown about 160% more. So population become 260%, while the economy has grown 170%. So this means that growth, even per capita growth, has been negative in the case of, but development, they didn't want development. So the danger for development is the growth and the spread of archaic culture, which is very compatible with the Islamic Republic. It is with the DNA of Islamic Republic. So the danger for the Shah's regime was that the people in the suburbs of Tehran were absorbed to the mosques. Islamic Republic will not bother at all. So that's the kind of culture they can provide. The difficulty for development is to provide a big push for the archaic people to move one step further, where the dynamics of development can start rolling by itself. If they don't want to move, to shift the people, in that case, you wouldn't have the problem. Of course, there are a great deal of conflicts in Iranian society now, but they are not of this nature. The nature of problem that we experienced in the case of Iran was that there was a change of paradigm was taking place. And this new paradigm was in contrast to the traditional paradigm. And the old unreformed religion represented the older paradigm. There was the contrast. Now, they would like to expand, and the all efforts of the establishment is to expand the archaic norms and the civilization. So there is no such conflict between the two. In case they wanted to attain development, which means to provide freedom, freedom of thought, of publication, and liberty to the people and the press. In that case, of course, they would face the same hurdles that the Shah did, but they haven't, and they wouldn't. because they would stop at providing liberty. Liberty is a part of development, not a part of growth. You can attain growth without it. China has done a successful job of providing growth without providing freedom to its individuals. And of course, in the context of that culture, they do not see individual as the engines of society. They see the mass of people as the engines, which is a uniform mass obeying the traditions and the laws of the ancient society. This is the kind of civilization we have in China. So in China, we do not meet that problem. This is why I've mentioned that in China, we had a great growth, but do we have development? No. Development comes with freedom and freedom of thought, of press, and of democracy. And none of them are existent in China. And this applies to Islamic Republic. We don't get this conflict because we are not on the path of development at all in Islamic Republic. They are trying, in order to increase wealth, they are trying to provide some growth in which they are not very successful.
Very well. So does that mean that every country has its own model of development? And if the answer to that is yes, what is the specific model of development for Iran?
Do excuse me, there was a noise in the background. I couldn't hear you well. The noise will come back again.
Okay, I will try to reduce the noise. I'm going to repeat my question, and the question was that based on what you just said, as a response to my last question, it seems to me that there is a specific model of development for each country, and there is not a universal model, I mean, one size fits all. And if there is a unique model of development for each country, what is the specific model for Iran's development?
Right. Well, here we come to the crux of the matter, really. That's a very sensitive question. Yes, there is no one path for development of the world. This is why this path is an epic task. It's a legendary task. So leaders of development must have ingenuity to discover the path for their own countries, in which they can mobilize internal resources, all internal resources, internal culture, cultural norm, even internal mythology, which will require an epic trip. So there is no one single way. But of course, studying the other countries provide a wealth of experience. To mention, for example, historically, the last 20 years of 18th century with Industrial Revolution in the UK, a unique experience. Why was it unique? Because the process of industrialization started in one country alone. It provided superiority for the UK, for British, to access all the markets, and wherever they entered, whichever market they entered, they were the champions. They could beat any. There was no rival. This is why the empire of Britain grew, behind which you had this strong engine of industrial revolution. So this is one unique experience for the UK. After that, of course, we have a repetition of the 30, 40 years in other European countries. France and the US in 1830 to 1860, they had their own process of growth. Germany in 1850 to 1875. Russia and Canada from 1890 to 1914. India and China from 1950 onwards, which is a continuing process up until now. Swedish growth in the beginning of 20th century. The only important resource the country had was the timber. They started their growth on timber, export of timber. Now they have become one of the very diverse and developed countries in the world. The British development, the late 20th century, late 20 years of the 20th century, 1980 onwards. It was a new development within a developed country, They changed the basis of their industry from industry to services. And the modern system was mostly anchored on computer and internet technology. They became a great producer and exporter of services and software in the world. So they changed the basis of their industry. But here becomes the question of, is it the same thing to have a development within a developed country as compared to a change and development in an undeveloped country? The answer is no. There are different regularities, different laws for development countries to expand and to grow more and more, because it's a process and development is going on in America, in Europe, in all modern countries, and to start a development in a non-developed country in which we have traditional hurdles, while, as we mentioned before, these hurdles have been removed in the case of these modern countries. In Europe and America, all of them, in one way or another, they have dealt with these hurdles, while we haven't dealt with them. This is why in Iran, in Turkey, which are the same road of development, we have the experience of Atatürk. For such a long period of 60, 70 years, yet we get the backlash of the new government of Turkey and the move backward by Turkey in the road to development. So this is why, how can we explain the situation? You see, the elements which are used by the backward leaning forces of society are the unreformed institutions within society. In the case of Turkey, where I have concentrated a bit of attention, family structure is one of those. Family structure, and of course, the Islamic institutions in place. They are the main hurdles of development for Turkey. And this is why Erdogan, now leaning on those areas, can provide a backlash and make a resistance, and even to some extent change the course of development. So the answer to the question is no, there is not a unique way for development. Each country has got to find its own way of it, and in which they've got to be resourceful, they've got to be ingenious, they've got to discover their own ways, how they can mobilize their own material resources, human resources, cultural resources, and even mythology in order to support the aims of development.
Some people have a tendency of drawing a correlation between democracy and development. Obviously, democratic countries are the most developed ones. That's one way of drawing that correlation. But in the crux of the matter lies the beginning of the journey towards development. And is democracy an absolute requirement before development occurs, or development could occur under a dictatorship and then evolve into democracy?
It should be allowed to mention that there is also the same background noise, and I tried to hear you well, and I did. I think I understood the question. You're asking about the development and democracy and the relation between the two.
That's right.
Well, again, looking at the world arena, it has gone in stages. In the case of Europe and America, which are different stories, but in the case of Europe, it has started with the Renaissance and reform.
Mm-hmm.
The birth and emergence of science, and later on technology, and later we've had industrial revolution. Before that, we had the movement of reformation of religion, which in some areas it were a bloody conflict. In the case of Germany, 30-year wars. In France and England. So in the 16th, 17th century, this is concluded in favor of reformed religion. In the case of America, the people who landed in the United States, they came from these countries where they had experienced reformation. So they were the bearers of reformation. They were modern people. There were hardworking people, ingenious people who wanted to create, and many of them honest people who wanted to build a life for themselves. This is how United States grew from a traditional society to a modern society. But does it necessarily lead to democracy? Well, there are, in the case of Europe, in the case of the countries or colonies of Britain, like Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and so on, and Canada, well, democracy has followed these changes. And democracy itself is, of course, a process. The face of democracy changes and it grows. But the foundation of it is based on Reformation, Renaissance, and the primacy of science and technology. And then you have the importance of individual and rights and individual rights, which start from John Locke's philosophy and so on and so forth, which is spread all over this world. Then you have democracy. But in the case of China, you have a development. You have a development to a certain extent, which is limited to the limits of growth. Not much, well, you have a development of education system, a spread of science in schools and so on and so forth. But the basis of science in the West has been the free individual and free thinking. And free thinking, we've got the ideas and hypotheses and hypothesizing and, of course, creation of science. Now, once the science is created, you can always adapt and copy it. So, do they necessarily need a democracy in their own society? Not necessarily. Yet the pressure is growing, but they also, the formal ideology of China is that no, we are not a society which is going to bend for democracy. We are a civilization in which individual is not our core in society, but we have families and groups which obey the tradition. Where is that going to lead? Well, it's not going to lead to development as we know it. So we have a different sort of civilization, which of course does not go without repression. And we have all of the reflections of this. Take the examples of coronavirus, where lack of freedom of talk was one of the important factors of the spread of this disease. So this is why the countries like Iran, they incline to copy the model of China, because under that system you can keep the monopoly of power without opening any windows towards the population. And of course you are striving for growth in order to have bigger wealth. Nobody wants less wealth in case, but to some areas, to some extent, wealth creation goes along with liberty. This is why the most productive countries so far have been the Western democracies, which have also established democracy. But this is the ideals that we know so far, that we have industries, industrial man, and developed society and democracy. The countries are in different stages of it. Some of them may get to democracy, some of them may not get to democracy. Say, even those who have successfully copied the models and teachings of science and technology, like South Korea, like Japan, they don't have the same kind of democracy that we have in the West. This is why, once we got to the integrity of man, do we have the same integrity of man in Japan that we see in the West? I don't think we do. They have a harmony within, well, on the face of it, they have the harmony within the families and their social system, but I don't think they will grow to the same extent unless they change those norms as creating democracy in the sense of the Western societies.
Very well. So now, against that backdrop, the difficult question to answer becomes whether this very sophisticated and complex affair of development, whether it is a non-stop train or are there stages to development and there are disruptions in development?
Well, there are certainly stages. And of course, great many books have been written about the stages of development. We start with the traditional society from which to go above and beyond. To achieve industrialization, we need some change in education and so on and so forth. Later on, we come to a stage when we need to cut off from the roots or continue upwards smoothly from those old roots and grow modern society. The point is, the nature of society changes. One thing which the leaders of development in certain areas, in certain countries, they have overlooked is that as once you start the process of development, the nature of life, the nature of society changes. You compare a toddler with an adolescent. We can't say a young man of 15 is 15 times older or bigger than a toddler 1 year old. A child, a baby is a baby. There's a quality change. This is what causes difficulty in the case of development in society. A developed society is a grown-up adult, while non-developed one can be compared to a child, which has a different set of its organisms and the way of functioning. So here comes the difficulty. Once we grow to that stage, then of course a strong will and plan and the knowledge of the roads and difficulties are required. And once we know that, we may overcome it. Otherwise, there's always a risk. Even for developed countries, we cannot take for granted. They may go back. The course may be reversed because human nature has a foot in biology, while development is social and historical. So we may go up in social development, and then the nature of time changes, the nature of society changes, the shape of society changes, the quality of laws changes. And in order to make these changes palatable, we need strong engines to move the society forward. Without providing this engine, we will not be able to take off. So the most important thing, which even economists of growth have talked about, is a takeoff period. Say, for example, Rostovian takeoff is very famous. You arrive, he explains, he gives you the elements. Once these are ready, then you get to the point of takeoff. That's the quantum moment. In that quantum moment, once you get the momentum to take off the move, then of course the dynamics of growth, of development itself takes the rein, takes the helm and rows it forward. But in case we cannot get to it, it will be almost impossible to move forward. So the process we start is full of, it's a minefield, the process of development. Being mindful of all those impediments, we've got to have plans for it and the clean and strong structures in order to take it forward to achieve development.
So does that mean that if in the absence of continuous development and a smooth ride for this train of development, there is some kind of a quantization in development and discontinuity in development? So is that what quantum moment in development is referred to?
Well, a quantum moment I would define as a point where we get the momentum to take off. And it's a unique singular moment, a moment of singularity where you can take off and go ahead. Up until that time, you gather force, the different elements which make for development, they gather force. But you come to an area where you need to take off, and that is the critical moment. So the main thing of development process is to provide for that, to get ready. How do we do that? In the case of Iran, look back, it was 1950s until Persian years. That was 1970s. Until 1970s, well, the process of growth was smooth until 72, 73. From 73 onwards until about 76, we had the difficulties. Difficulties express themselves in the form of social anomalies like identity crisis, inflation, unemployment, stagflation. Indeed, 1976 was the year of stagflation, where we got, after about 15 years of an average 4% inflation, we got an inflation of 26%, which played into the hands of the clergy, of course. So these are the areas that both economically, politically, once we grew, more liberties were required. So people who grew up in 15 years as individuals, respectful, having rights, they demanded more political rights, which was not given. So political rights were barred while you had individual rights, and your individual behaviors were not controlled. You were afraid to do whatever you like to go wherever you want to do, and to dress the way you wanted to. Yet, lack of political and social freedom, like publishing your book, speaking the way you wished to express yourself, because they were barred, then there was resent. So this is the result of a growth that you create. You create this modern intelligentsia of about few million people. And then if you cannot accommodate for them in a system of freedom, then you've got to revert back and create a system of suppression. One-party system was a wrong response to the people in that society. One-party system in itself, one-party system, we needed some liberalization and accommodating for the new forces which had entered the country. And of course, the forces of development, who were the forces of development? The workers in the factories, millions of them, especially around Tehran, Tabriz, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Millions of workers. These people, the intelligentsia and technicians and modern managers. And then you had a bureaucracy, which was not very clean and modern, of course, but a part of it, modern sections of it, like the plan organization and so on, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Commerce, Central Bank, they were all in the service of development. So these people needed to be supported. While they were not supported, they were suppressed. They were suppressed by the unique, unified one party of Resurgence Party, Rastakhi's party. And these are the bearers of the modern culture. The bearers of modern culture did not have any support. They didn't have an organization. The reason why they did not support the system which had brought them up and made them thrive, we didn't have any resistance from these people to support the system, the fruits of which were themselves. Well, certainly there are vacuums in areas. So this modern groups, modern strata of society, they needed to be more organized, more educated, more goal-oriented, and to be made aware of where they were going. They were not, they didn't know. This brought about a chaos in society, in the intellectual life. You know, in the last 5-6 years, the intellectual life is a chaos. Intellectuals are not mostly they are not modern. They are backward people. And these backward people who are giving speeches here and there in Hosseiniye, Ershad, and so on and so forth, these people, they were representative of the archaic society. Why could not the modern layers of society offset the effect of these old strata? Well, they're important questions. Because one of the requirements of the system which leads the engine of development is to stabilize, to provide institutions, to organize, and to provide ideas and raison d'etre for these groups who are beneficiaries of development. One last point which is important to mention is that development is not only positive. It has both positive and negative results. It has winners and losers. The winners of revolution, the winners of innovation, of modernization, and of development are the new classes and strata layers of society, while the archaic layers of society may feel that they are now taking the back seat. So special measures are required to keep them calm, silent, and to stop them from revolting. So these areas, in case they get out of harmony and a management which is not conscious of all these, then of course the possibility of a collapse is possible. This is what we experience in the case of Iran.
So one can summarize your answer to my last question as whenever there is a discontinuity, whenever there is a kink in the smooth growth curve, then that amounts to the quantum moment. And Iran had this quantum moment when the social forces released by the economic growth became released into the cities and urban areas, and they became the foot soldiers of reactionary forces of religion. And they basically took their conflict out in the streets and overthrew the government.
Yes, of course. In the case of Iran, if we are looking for that quantum moment, it was in 1970s. Then some critical measures needed to be taken, but before that, there was a need which was overlooked of dealing with these old institutions, archaic institutions, norms, and moralities. These were not taken care of. Instead, they were strengthened. You look at the statistics of clergy, which grew to about 140,000 clergy in 1979. These people, who were the bearers of a very dangerous culture, they had all the privileges from the state, exemption from military services, and direct payments by the states to these people who were doing the seminary work, the clergy work. And of course, the freedom. They had the freedom of speech everywhere, while writers didn't have that freedom. There was essential for writers, while those didn't have it. This is why there was a mislocation of priorities by the leadership of development. Instead of strengthening the engines of development, they were building on a misguided strategy, strengthening the clergy in order to play them against the communism, while it proved that communism was not the main enemy of the system. It was the clergy which was the main enemy. So these misguided strategies and confusions can, of course, lead the process of development to collapse, which unfortunately in the case of Iran we did experience.
Well, and that brings us to the end of our 12th episode of Lucid Horizon, our sixth one with you. And that was fascinating and very enlightening and educational. And for that, I'm thankful and grateful to you for your generosity with time and your insight, Professor Mansour.
I'm grateful, Professor Kangaroo. Thank you very much for your attention.
We hope to continue this conversation next time with another episode of Lucid Horizon and continue learning from Professor Mansour. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.